While the problem of evil is primarily addressed against monotheistic faiths, again, the problem is, put in fairly basic terms, that if God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, there should be no evil, but there is evil. Therefore, either God doesn't exist, or he's not all good, or he's not all knowing, or he's not all powerful. Now, the particular monotheistic problem, of course, wasn't faced by ancient thinkers, but they did face the problem of imperfection and evil. Because the question is, how does imperfection get into the world? So the general question is, laying aside questions of religion, is where does evil come from? Now, for the ancient thinkers, such as Aristotle and Plato, the cause of evil, or less judgmentally, the cause of imperfection, was taken to be matter. Now, this, in a way, would solve the problem, because for Aristotle and Plato, matter was believed to be uncreated. So it's not something that is created, it's always been. So imperfection is just part of the world, and there's no need to justify its existence. It simply is the defects of matter. Now, then leap ahead to the rise of Christianity and other monotheistic faiths. How do they handle it? Because in the case of the ancients, they could say, hey, pre-existing matter, that's where imperfection comes from, that's a story. But in the case of monotheistic faiths that have God as the creator, there's no easy escape this way, because God created the matter. Now, to use an analogy, suppose you've been hired to construct a building, and someone else is providing the material that you work with, and you do a great job, but the contractor that provides the cement and so forth, they cut corners, and so you get lousy cement, and you get terrible materials. And in that case, you can place the blame justifiably on the person supplying the bad materials. It's not your fault. You're doing the best you can with poor stuff. But imagine if you have a company that handles everything. They make the cement, they make the bricks, they provide the lumber, and they do the construction. And if all the material is terrible, they can't say, hey, it's somebody else's fault. They've got the responsibility for the bad material. So the option of, hey, it's pre-existing matter, what are we going to do, is not available for those who claim that God created everything. So what's Leibniz's solution going to be? Well, his workaround is this. He replaces the imperfection of matter with the necessary truths, the eternal truths. So this is what he claims. He takes the intellectualist view. And as you might recall, for the intellectualist, the idea is that God's intellect is, superior to his will, or limits it, such that God can do anything except the impossible. So God understands and accepts the limits of, logic and eternal truths. So because of this, when creatures are created, they're going to be imperfect. Because creatures that are, less than perfect, obviously are going to be limited in their essence, and hence these imperfect creatures cannot know everything and can deceive themselves and commit other mistakes. So sort of one way that, when I say that God gets off the hook here, is that he's limited by the laws of logic, so he can't create perfect beings. And since we're imperfect, we're going to do bad stuff, because either we'll act from ignorance and do bad stuff without knowing better, and we'll make other mistakes as well. And so Leibniz sees this as somewhat getting God off the hook. Now, then of course the question arises, why does God have to make us lacking, make us imperfect? Well, one of the sort of clever moves in the game of solving the problem of evil is to take evil to be a privation, to be a lack, to not be a positive thing. So how does this work? Well, what Leibniz does is he goes back to Plato, and Plato didn't really face like a problem of evil, because again, Plato's not a Christian. He doesn't believe in a perfect God that's all good, all powerful, and knowing. But Plato still had to explain the imperfection of the world, because he has his perfect forms, and then stuff here is imperfect. So for the ancients, it was more of the problem of imperfection. So in his creation story, the Timaeus, Plato said the origin of the world involved understanding united to necessity. That is to say, you have what must be, and that limits what can be. Other thinkers, past Plato, back when people started believing in a monotheistic God, they united God and nature. And so in this role, God would be the understanding, to use Leibniz's term, and the necessity, the essential nature of things, is the object of understanding as far as it consists in the eternal verities. In other words, the necessity is the limits set by eternal truths. And Leibniz, being intellectualist, believed that God follows these rules, these truths. And so God looks inward, and he follows his understanding, his intellect. So this is where the evil gets in. What Leibniz calls the primitive form of good and the origin of evil. So he swaps out for, in the case of the ancients, the matter the ancients said was a cause of imperfection, and he puts in their place the eternal truths. Now, it's not that eternal truths are now like playing the role of matter, broadly speaking. It's not like things are made out of eternal truths like things are supposed to be made out of matter. But the idea is this. Again, for ancients like Aristotle and Plato, we use Plato as the example, matter is imperfect, and so when the perfect forms try to shape the matter, it's going to be imperfect. To use the obvious analogy, if you ever try to make a sandcastle, when you're trying to work with sand, it's not that good to work with. It's not the fault of if you're using like a pail to make your sandcastle, it's not the fault of the pail, it's the fault of the sand. Now, in the case of the eternal truths, what they do is this. When God, does his thing, he's limited by the eternal truths. They set a limit on what he can do. So this allows Leibniz to make evil into a privation, not a positive thing. How so? Well, going back to Aristotle's and Aquinas' terminology about the efficient cause, what brought it about, he claims the formal character of evil has no efficient cause. This is to say, in less technical terms, that God doesn't make evil. Why? Well, evil is not a positive thing in the world. It is a privation. It is a lack. So the efficient cause, again, efficient cause in this context doesn't mean like really effective, like getting good gas mileage. It means, what is bringing it about. And so God, when he creates the world, he doesn't go, let there be earth and let there be, the heavens and stars and moons and so forth, and then let there be some evil. No, he doesn't do that. The evil comes about because it's what he does not create. It's the gaps. To use an analogy involving cheese, suppose you wanted to make Swiss cheese for some reason. Now, when you're making it, suppose you get like a Swiss cheese kit. You wouldn't have in there a bag of holes to dump into the cheese mix and then mix it in and then make the cheese. The holes are a lack of cheese. You don't add those. They're part of the cheese making process. So using this analogy, which is not Leibniz's, you can think of evil as a privation as like the holes in the cheese. So in this analogy, God makes the cheese, but he doesn't make the holes. So as Leibniz notes, the schoolmen, the scholastics, which were a school of philosophers, they said the cause of evil is deficient. It's not a positive thing. So the way he gets off the hook here, boiling this all down, the gist is this. So he's an intellectualist, so God's will is limited by his intellect. He can't do the impossible. Because of the laws of logic, God can't make another perfect being, because that would be, impossible for the reasons we saw earlier. So everything has to be inferior to God. Now, he doesn't put the defects in there. He doesn't make things defective. He makes things that have defects. And that's where the evil comes in. Going back to the cheese analogy, he makes the cheese, he doesn't make the holes. So he's not responsible for those. And so that is evil as a privation, and Leibniz's response to that aspect of the problem of evil. Now, one of Leibniz's other main replies to the problem of evil is this classic analogy of the boat, which we'll look at next.